On the afternoon of October 27, 1942, a 6-pounder anti-tank gun on the southwest edge of a tiny desert outpost in North Africa had 1 officer, 1 sergeant, and almost no ammunition left. 8 Italian tanks were grinding toward them across the sand at 600 yards and closing. The rest of the guns around the position were either destroyed or had no shells to fire, and the man who ran over to help load that gun, the man feeding rounds into the breach while machine gun bullets kicked up dirt all around him, was the battalion commander himself, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner, who had already been wounded hours earlier and refused to stop. They knocked out 5 of those tanks before the Italians closed to 400 yards. And they were far from finished, because this fight had been going on since dawn, and it would keep going until dark. This is the story of Outpost Snipe, October 1942. The North African desert near a railway stop called El Alamein in Egypt. For months, the British 8th Army and the Axis forces under Erwin Rommel had been grinding against each other across hundreds of miles of sand and rock, trading ground back and forth as supplies and fuel came and went. Neither side could land a knockout blow. Rommel had pushed deep into Egypt earlier that year, threatening the Suez Canal and the oil fields beyond it. The first battle at El Alamein in July had stopped him, but just barely. Now the British had a new commander. General Bernard Montgomery had taken over the 8th Army in August after the original replacement, General William Gott, was killed when his plane was shot down on the way to take command. Montgomery was methodical to the point of obsession. He spent the next 2 months doing something the 8th Army had rarely done in this campaign. He waited. He built up his forces, stockpiled tanks and guns and ammunition, and trained his troops specifically to punch through the massive Axis minefields that stretched across the desert. He wanted overwhelming superiority before he attacked, and he got it. By October, the 8th Army had over 1,000 tanks, close to 1,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 200,000 men. Rommel had about 500 tanks, many of them Italian models that could barely compete with the newer British and American equipment. And his fuel situation was desperate. Almost none of the supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were getting through. On the night of October 23rd, Montgomery launched Operation Lightfoot. Nearly 600 British guns opened up in a massive barrage, and 4 infantry divisions began advancing on a 16-mile front. The plan was straightforward on paper. Infantry would push forward and seize positions. Engineers would clear lanes through the minefields. Then, British armoured divisions would pass through those lanes and destroy Rommel's panzer reserves in open ground. It did not go that smoothly. Arguments broke out between tank commanders and infantry officers about where the front line actually was. Map reading in featureless desert turned out to be more of an art than a science, and nobody could agree on where anyone actually stood. The confusion got so bad that headquarters ordered troops to fire flares so their positions could be triangulated from observation posts. Even that did not settle the arguments, because some tank units refused to believe the flares showed they were further back than they thought. By October 26th, the offensive was stalling. Montgomery needed to keep pushing, to crumble the Axis defenses and draw their tanks into fights where British guns could destroy them. 2 battalions of the 7th Motor Brigade received orders to advance past the front lines and seize 2 positions southwest of a terrain feature called Kidney Ridge. 1 battalion would take a position codenamed Woodcock. The other, the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade under Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner, would take the position codenamed Snipe. Turner was not a man who rattled easily. He came from a military family in Berkshire, and military barely covers it. His older brother Alexander had won a Victoria Cross in the First World War. His other brother made brigadier in the Royal Artillery. Victor himself had been commissioned into the Rifle Brigade in 1918, straight out of Sandhurst, and had served through the chaos of the Desert Campaign since the early days. The men under his command respected him because he had a calm about him that did not waver when things fell apart. But the orders he received on the afternoon of October 26th would have made anyone uneasy. The battalion had already taken casualties during the first days of Operation Lightfoot, supporting engineers clearing minefields. They were down to just 76 riflemen and 22 Bren gun carriers. To bring the force up to strength, they had been reinforced with 16 sappers from the 7th Field Squadron and a battery of anti-tank gunners from the 76th Anti-Tank Regiment, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. That brought the total force to about 300 men, with 19 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Their job was to march through the minefields in the dark, seize this little depression called Snipe, dig in, and hold it until the 24th Armoured Brigade could push through and join them. The problem was that nobody could agree on where Snipe actually was. Turner's own navigator gave a bearing of 233 degrees for the march. But when the creeping artillery barrage kicked off at 10:55 p.m. on October 26th, it advanced on a bearing of 270 degrees, a completely different direction. Turner had to make a call: follow his navigator or follow the barrage that was supposed to be clearing the way ahead. He chose the barrage. That decision cost 10 minutes of confusion as the men scrambled to reorganize and follow the shells, but it probably saved them from marching into the wrong stretch of desert entirely. The battalion pushed forward through dust that lay 18 inches deep in the minefield lanes. Some of the men had been fighting in the desert since 1940. They knew how to move at night. They passed through the positions of the 5th Black Watch and the 1st Gordon Highlanders without incident, took 20 prisoners along the way, scattered several parties of Axis infantry, and by about midnight arrived at what they believed was Snipe. It was not Snipe. They were actually about 800 yards southeast of the real objective, at a similar-looking depression with an abandoned German supply dump in it. But Turner did not know that, and in the desert at night, one shallow dip in the ground looks much like another. He ordered the battalion to dig in and fired a rocket signal for the vehicles carrying the heavy guns to come forward. The trucks and gun carriers crawled through the sand, wrestling with long ridges that bogged down the vehicles. But by 3:45 a.m., 19 of the 27 6-pounder guns had been unloaded and dug into firing positions around the perimeter of the depression, which stretched about 1,000 yards long and 500 yards wide in a rough oval shape. The guns of B Company faced southeast. C Company covered the southwest. A company pointed northwest and north. The 6 guns of the Welsh Fusiliers battery covered the north and northeast. The infantry dug deep. Some of these men had years of experience in the desert, and they knew that when the sun came up, the only thing standing between them and a tank round was the depth of their foxhole. Then, around 4 a.m., a carrier patrol from C Company drove west and stumbled into something unexpected. About 160 Axis soldiers were sitting there ready to surrender. But before British infantry could round them all up, the patrol ran straight into a lager, a nighttime camp, of about 35 Italian and German tanks with self-propelled guns and infantry. The carriers opened fire, set 3 enemy trucks ablaze, lost one of their own vehicles, and pulled back fast. Most of the prisoners scattered in the confusion, though 35 stayed behind. That was the first sign of what was waiting for them out there in the dark. They were not sitting behind the front lines on a quiet piece of desert. They had parked themselves right in the middle of the Axis armored reserve. And when they looked north, campfires showed yet another tank lager, this one belonging to the 15th Panzer Division, about 1,000 yards away. They were surrounded by enemy tanks, and they had not even finished digging their foxholes. The sun came up on October 27th, and the men of the 2nd Rifle Brigade could finally see where they were. Flat, scrubby desert in every direction, baked hard in some places and soft enough to swallow a wheel in others. Low scrub brush that might hide a man lying flat but would not stop a bullet, and enemy armor on 3 sides. The temperature was already climbing toward what would become a brutal midday heat, and the men had limited water. Some of them had been in this desert for 2 years. They knew exactly what was coming. The first shots came almost immediately. The German tanks in the northern lager began moving westward, away from the British front lines. In doing so, they drove right across the front of the anti-tank guns on the northwest face of the outpost, exposing their flanks completely. The 6-pounder crews opened fire. For 30 minutes, the north end of the position vanished in explosions, smoke, and flying sand as the Axis tanks and artillery fired back. At the same time, part of the Kampfgruppe Stiefelmeier force that had been camped nearby reappeared about 800 yards to the southwest and also moved with their sides turned toward the British guns. In that first exchange, the gunners claimed 6 German tanks, 8 Italian tanks, and 2 self-propelled guns destroyed, with 2 more tanks damaged. They lost 3 anti-tank guns knocked out and 1 that sank into the soft sand. Several men were killed or wounded by the return fire, and daylight showed that some of the gun positions were too exposed and needed to be moved. That was only the first 30 minutes of a fight that would last all day. Around 7:30 a.m., the 47th Royal Tank Regiment from the 24th Armoured Brigade crested a ridge to the east. They were supposed to be the reinforcements, the friendly armour that would link up with Snipe and push the offensive forward. Instead, the tank crews saw a position surrounded by burning German vehicles and assumed it was a German outpost. They opened fire on the Rifle Brigade. Turner sent an officer racing back in a Bren gun carrier, waving frantically to get the tanks to stop shooting. The closest tank ceased fire after about 30 minutes, but the rest kept going. British tanks were now shelling their own men. And it got worse. As the British tanks moved forward, the Rifle Brigade gunners at the south end of Snipe spotted about 25 German tanks with long-barreled guns, Panzer IIIs and Panzer IV Specials, sneaking behind a ridge to set up an ambush against those same British tanks. The Germans had their sides exposed to the 6-pounders again. The anti-tank crews opened fire and hit 3 more, and the 47th Tank Crews machine-gunned the German crews as they tried to bail out. But the arrival of the British tanks at Snipe turned the outpost into a magnet for every Axis gun in the area. A storm of artillery fire crashed down on the position. The whole place disappeared in smoke and explosions and spraying sand for what felt like an eternity. The German tanks started firing smoke shells at the British armour, and then their anti-tank guns aimed at the smoke, which was a lot easier to spot than a camouflaged vehicle. Within a couple of hours, the 47th was down to 5 Shermans and 6 Crusaders. They were ordered to pull back. So was the 41st Royal Tank Regiment, which had lost another 12 tanks. The Armoured Brigade was not coming through Snipe. The Rifle Brigade was on its own, and their problems kept piling up. The battalion's forward observation officer, the man who directed artillery fire, had gone out on a reconnaissance before dawn and vanished. Without him, the British guns behind the lines could not aim properly. When the artillery did fire, the shells landed on Outpost Snipe instead of around it. Turner's men had to radio back repeatedly to get their own artillery to stop hitting them, and they did not manage to shut it down completely until 12:30 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the position was cut off from resupply. The ambulances and supply trucks were parked behind the ridge to the east, ready and waiting. But every time a vehicle appeared above the crest, Axis artillery and machine guns zeroed in on it instantly. Nothing could get through. 3 carriers loaded with the most badly wounded men made a dash for the ridge and reached safety. But the return trip was impossible. The ammunition was running out, and there was no way to bring more in. Just before noon, 6 Bren gun carriers inside the perimeter were hit and caught fire. The heat and smoke from the burning vehicles drifted over the gun positions, making it even harder to see and fight. Gunners were falling as casualties, and the surviving crews started improvising. Men moved from one wrecked gun to the next, scavenging parts and ammunition. 2 men drove jeeps back and forth between guns, splitting whatever shells were left, so that every gun had at least something to fire. Conditions inside Snipe were getting worse by the hour. The midday heat pressed down on the position while the number of wounded kept climbing. The battalion medical officer and the ambulances had been left behind at the start line the night before and had never been able to move forward in daylight. The only medical care available was shell dressings and water, and the water was running low too. Men lay in shallow trenches with shrapnel wounds and burns, unable to be evacuated, listening to the fighting continue around them. By early afternoon, Only 13 guns were still working to cover a perimeter that stretched 2,500 yards. Some of them had fewer than 10 rounds apiece, and the attacks kept coming. Around 1 p.m., 8 Italian M1340 tanks, a self-propelled gun, and infantry came rolling over a ridge to the southwest. On that section of the perimeter, only one 6-pounder was still operational. One gun against 8 tanks. This is where Turner earned his Victoria Cross. He ran to the gun. The officer in command, Lieutenant Toms, and a sergeant named Calistan were the only crew left. Turner joined them as a loader. They held their fire and watched the tanks close from 600 yards to 500 to 400. Then they opened up. Turner fed the shells, Calistan aimed and fired. They knocked out 5 tanks and the self-propelled gun before the remaining Italians closed to 400 yards, and then they were out of ammunition at the gun. Lieutenant Tom sprinted to a jeep and drove across open ground to a knocked-out gun position nearby, looking for any rounds left behind. Axis machine guns raked the jeep the entire way. He found ammunition, loaded it, and drove back through the same fire. By the time he reached the gun, a bullet had hit the jeep's fuel tank and it was on fire. Turner and another man ran to the burning jeep and started hauling rounds off of it with their bare hands, while the Italian tanks, now at 200 yards, fired machine guns directly at them. Calistan went back to the gun and aimed. 200 yards, practically point blank for a tank. He fired and hit the first of the 3 remaining tanks. Then the second, then the third. All 3 caught fire and none of the crews got out. 8 tanks attacked that one gun position. 8 tanks were destroyed. Turner had been wounded during the jeep unloading. He had actually been wounded earlier in the day too, during the initial setup, but had kept going. Now the wound was bad enough that he could barely stand. He still refused treatment. Instead, he walked the perimeter, checking every gun position until the pain finally became too much. By 4 p.m., most of the officers in the battalion were casualties, and the guns were being commanded by wounded sergeants and corporals, and Rommel was not done. He had been watching the fighting around Snipe from his headquarters and decided to throw everything he had at the area. He assembled parts of the 90th Light Division, the 21st Panzer Division, the 15th Panzer Division, the 164th Light Africa Division, and a battle group from the Italian Ariete Armored Division. About 70 tanks and self-propelled guns formed up in 2 waves, roughly 1,200 yards west of the outpost. The plan was a 5-minute bombardment, followed by a Stuka dive bombing attack. Then the tanks would roll east through the Rifle Brigade's position and smash into the British armor behind the ridge. The Stukas came in first, 20 of them with an escort of 20 Italian Fiat fighters and 20 Messerschmitt 109s. But American P-40S from the 64th and 65th Fighter Squadrons intercepted them and shot down 6 of the escorts. Then 24 RAF Hurricanes from 33 and 213 Squadrons piled in and claimed 2 Stukas, 4 Fiats, and 3 Messerschmitts. The dive bombing attack was scattered before it reached the target. The tanks came anyway. Part of the force swung north toward Australian positions near Point 29, where British artillery tore them apart. The southern group, about 30 German and 10 Italian tanks, drove straight toward the 24th Armoured Brigade's positions behind the ridge and passed right by the guns of the Welch Fusiliers Battery on the northeast face of Snipe. 7 of those tanks came within 200 yards of the battery. The gunners destroyed 9 tanks, damaged several more, and an A Company 6-pounder crew claimed 4 additional kills. The surviving tanks pulled back into low ground near Kidney Ridge. Then the second wave attacked. 15 Panzer IIIs turned toward the northwest perimeter of Snipe, where only 2 6-pounders were still working. A third gun was hauled around just in time. Between the 3 guns, they had 30 armor-piercing rounds left, total, for all 3. The German tanks moved carefully this time. They used every piece of cover they could find, every dip and ridge and sand mound, and they machine-gunned the 6-pounder positions as they advanced, driving the crews into their foxholes. Riflemen lying in slit trenches nearby watched the guns go silent and wondered if the crews were all dead. Some of the infantrymen thought about crawling to the guns and firing them themselves, but the machine gun fire was too intense. When 3 tanks reached 100 yards, a sergeant crawled 50 yards across open ground to one of the abandoned guns. He operated it alone. He hit the first tank twice. Then he swung the gun and hit the second. Then the third. One of the rounds went clean through the second tank and struck the one behind it. 3 tanks burning at 100 yards, fired by one man working the gun by himself. The rest of the German force pulled back to about 800 yards and sat there machine gunning the position for the rest of the afternoon, never closing to where the anti-tank guns could reach them again. By late afternoon, the battlefield around Outpost Snipe was scattered with roughly 70 burning or abandoned Axis vehicles. Inside the perimeter, the Rifle Brigade had lost 16 Bren gun carriers and 10 6-pounder guns destroyed, with another 5 damaged beyond use. Turner ordered the maps and codebooks burned, convinced this might be the end. At 6:44 p.m., a signal went out to 7th Motor Brigade headquarters asking about reinforcements. Reinforcements were promised, but no armored counterattack came. As the light started to fade, the survivors from the perimeter positions dragged themselves and their wounded toward the command post, moving low across the ground, while Axis machine guns fired horizontal streams of bullets just above the sand. At 7:40 p.m., as the last daylight died, the German tanks moved northeast, and some of them were briefly silhouetted against the sky. The British gunners fired their last anti-tank rounds. They hit one more. After checking that every remaining 6-pounder had been disabled so the enemy could not use them, the last unwounded men prepared to leave. No relief force appeared. At 10:30 p.m., the survivors of A and C companies walked out with one single 6-pounder loaded onto a damaged truck. They passed through the darkness between the lines without being fired on, because both sides were out in the sand collecting their wounded. The 2nd Rifle Brigade suffered 72 casualties. A committee of investigation concluded a month later that they had destroyed between 52 and 57 Axis armored vehicles, including 22 German and 10 Italian tanks and 5 self-propelled guns. The day before the battle, Rommel's Panzerarmee had 137 operational tanks. The day after, it had 114. The fighting at Outpost Snipe did not account for all of that difference, but it accounted for a lot of it. Rommel himself wrote about what happened. He described the fire that struck his counterattack force as murderous and concluded that an armored assault against defenders who had been able to prepare their positions was unlikely to succeed. That was exactly the lesson the British wanted to teach him, and 300 men in a shallow hole in the desert had taught it. The battle for Outpost Snipe had been exactly the kind of fight Montgomery needed. It bled Rommel's tank reserves at a moment when every panzer mattered, and it proved that well-trained infantry with the right anti-tank weapons could stand against armor and win. Within days, Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge, the knockout blow that finally broke through the Axis lines and sent Rommel's army retreating westward into Libya. El Alamein was the turning point of the entire North African campaign, and Outpost Snipe was one of the fights that made it possible. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions on October 27th. His citation noted that he led his battalion forward 4,000 yards through difficult country in the dark, organized the grueling defense, and when a gun had only one officer and one sergeant left, he joined them as a loader and helped destroy 5 tanks himself, all while wounded and under constant fire from 5:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sergeant Calistan, who had aimed the gun that stopped those 8 tanks at point-blank range, was recommended for the Victoria Cross as well. He received the Distinguished Conduct Medal instead. He was later commissioned as an officer, but was killed in the Italian campaign before the war ended. The daily sketch newspaper called Outpost Snipe the finest action of the war. Whether that is true depends on which actions you measure it against. What is not debatable is this. 300 men with 19 anti-tank guns held an isolated position for an entire day against the better part of 2 panzer divisions with no resupply, no reliable artillery support, friendly tanks accidentally shooting at them, and their own artillery landing on their heads. They destroyed more enemy armor than most full armored brigades managed in a single engagement, and they walked out under their own power when it was over. If this video taught you something new about World War II, drop a like, leave a comment with the craziest detail you heard, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one.